Hi, as Professor Surden said, I'm Lucas Bednarik. I'm a first-year student here at Colorado Law, and it's my pleasure to introduce our established use case panel today, beginning with David Sullivan, our moderator, who is the Executive Director of Digital Trust and Safety at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, Becky Foley, Vice President of Trust and Safety at Tripadvisor, Melissa Stroebel, Vice President of Business Development and Strategic Impact at Thorn, and Dave Willner, who's co-founder of Zentropi Incorporated. So without further ado, join me in welcoming our established use case panel.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks everybody for making it here through the snow and weather today to join us or joining us online. So I'm David Sullivan. I'm direct the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which I'll speak about briefly, but more importantly, I have the pleasure of being on the advisory board at Silicon Flatirons, and it's always a pleasure to be here, both with the incredible speakers that Silicon Flatirons brings to these events, as well as the audience, which always asks incredible questions. So we're looking forward to your questions towards the end of this panel. You have the names and titles of our speakers. I am just incredibly pleased to be bringing this group together. We have an incredibly seasoned panel of folks who've been doing this work for a long time, have risen through the ranks from the front lines, and I think I'm just looking forward to learning from. So for this panel, this really dates back to a conversation that Harry and I had in the fall when I learned about this sort of theme for this event, the idea of using AI well. And I said, actually, I think that what we in the industry of digital products and services call trust and safety is actually one of the best examples of this, notwithstanding the fact that every day you read about a dozen different examples of horrible things that are going on in the world in terms of online content and behavior, oftentimes supplemented or amplified or in some way aided by trust and safety. But in fact, and those are all very real problems we're going to talk about. We're probably going to touch on some challenging issues, just as a warning. But nonetheless, AI sort of coming out of the world of sort of automation and use of technology to address challenges around user-generated content is something that's been used by teams inside companies for decades. How that's being used and how it's changing is something that's really quite dramatically has shifted, much in the way that the broader AI conversation has shifted. And I'm really looking forward to talking about that with this group. Before we open it up to the panel, I just did want to say, so at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which I have the pleasure of running, we bring together companies who provide all different types of digital products and services, from very large platforms like Meta and Microsoft to a small AI chatbot startup and a internet infrastructure company around best practices in this space. And the idea is that rather than trying to standardize what type of content or behavior should be allowed across all the many different services that make up the internet, we can instead try to organize and align and standardize and mature the practices that companies use to address whatever it is the thing that they don't want on their service, from things that are universally unwanted and illegal, like child sexual material, to things that might be more particular to specific platforms, like fake reviews on a service like Tripadvisor. So we do that. We've developed an international standard, which I've got a couple hard copies of with me today, called the SAFE Framework, that sets out a framework of those practices. And we've been thinking a lot about the use of AI in this space. And 2 years ago, in 2024, we convened a working group of our members to look at best practices around the use of AI in trust and safety, looking both at sort of established use cases as well as what the possibilities were for using generative AI as part of things like content moderation and trust and safety more broadly. At the time, we came up with about 30 use cases, 11 different challenges, 11 best practices that could sort of respond to those challenges. I think another 11 or 10 considerations for future use, and a few different ideas for how to move forward. We tried not to make bold, wild predictions of the kind that Harry just talked about, but I think a lot of what we identified 2 years ago has borne out, except that even then, even talking to companies who were ones involved in frontier models, there was still, I think, an enormous amount of caution about, yes, maybe AI can help us here and there, but also we have all of these other considerations that maybe make us cautious about deploying it. That has changed dramatically. I think we'll talk more about how that has changed dramatically in this panel. So, I think oftentimes when you may hear about AI and the world of online content and conduct, it will either be in relation to those bold announcements and predictions from CEOs saying that AI is going to take care of all of this without giving much nuance to that, or through incidents either of harmful things that you read about, including a lot of the AI used for non-consensual intimate imagery or AI-generated child sexual abuse imagery, those kinds of issues. Or you hear about this in the context of kind of issues that put this into the spotlight. Like, for example, when during the COVID lockdown pandemic, companies were not basically not able to deploy the content moderators that were bringing them into the office in different places around the world. So AI took over. That didn't go great at the moment. But these things are, I think, not giving the full picture of what this is all about. And that's what we want to try to do in this discussion today. So as I mentioned, we have some of the best in the world at this, and bringing together perspectives from a nonprofit organization that both does research and builds tools, Thorn, somebody working inside one of the largest travel platforms, thinking about these issues in a way that you might not ordinarily think about the kind of issues that are in the world of online safety, and then somebody who's started a company to try to use generative AI to solve some of the problems that have perennially plagued challenges around how to do moderation and classification of content at scale, having done it from the beginning across several different companies. We'll talk about all about that, but I want to start really with understanding the landscape here and starting with some of the most challenging issues. So I'm going to start with Melissa from Thorn. Melissa, so Thorn, and I would love for you to explain to folks what Thorn is and what you guys do better than I can. But you both are a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children stay safe online. And you do that both through conducting really path-breaking research, but also building and deploying tools for the detection and investigation of child sexual abuse imagery and other sort of child sexual exploitation issues, which again is some of the most difficult and challenging material that there is, that everyone is contending with in this space. So what are you seeing in terms of the research side, and what are you guys doing about it in terms of the tools?
Yeah, and very excited to be with you all today on this very snowy morning. It was a long drive from Evergreen today, but very grateful for four-wheel drive. David, thank you for the description of Thorn. Pretty much caps it up wonderfully. We are a nonprofit that builds technology to combat child sexual exploitation in the digital age. Now, I want to back up just a little bit to set the stage, because while we focus really on that lens of combating child sexual exploitation in the digital age, it didn't start in the digital age. And that's a really important thing for us to always keep in mind, because yes, technology is changing it, but it didn't inherently create this problem, and it will persist through all the subsequent technical innovations that happen. Unfortunately, we have to ground ourselves in that human behavior piece of it and thinking how technology is either being weaponized by those individuals or how it can be deployed by those on the front lines who are combating this issue. So zooming back before the internet, a lot of us just assumed that our kids were safe if they were home under our roof in a protected space. Curfew hits, kids come home, we don't have to worry about it. At that point in time, the biggest risk was somebody who had direct access to the child, a parent, a coach, a trusted member of the community. Now, that is still the case. The predominant amount of hands-on sexual exploitation of minors is perpetrated by those in their communities, the trusted adults. But technology changed it because now cameras came along and we could memorialize that exploitation. And then the internet came along and it was much easier to share those images. Child sexual abuse material, or CSAM as we shorten it to, could spread much more quickly. Interesting little tidbit, does anybody want to guess what the leading investigative agency was combating child sexual exploitation in the 90s and early 2000s? Might surprise you. And Beck? So you might be thinking of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who is the National Clearinghouse for Reports, but actually the federal agency was the US Postal Inspection Service. Because before the internet, the way that these images were most often shared was either directly handed off or through the Postal Service. Now, USPS continues to be part of the ecosystem combating these crimes, but now there's so many more agencies involved because it became easier to share the pictures, and then it became easier to meet others who had experience exploiting kids and could give them security tips and could encourage them. Then it became easier to meet potential victims online, and now it's even easier using AI to create the images themselves. Now, again, AI didn't create this problem, and AI is going to be part of the solution, but it is an important component. When I was working back at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, my job was reviewing these images back in the early 2000s. And at that point, NCMEC was receiving about 100,000 images or 100,000 reports of online sexual exploitation a year. Last year, they reported receiving over 20 million reports. And those reports contained more than 60 million files that needed to be reviewed by humans oftentimes. And we have seen over the last 2 decades the ways that technology came into the equation for those teams reviewing these images to help us get through that massive pile that much faster. Now, in addition to the research that we do at Thorn, because what we need to understand is how the human beings are experiencing these risks. We survey young people every year to hear from them, to understand what they're seeing, what they're worried about, and how it impacts them. We're surveying trust and safety professionals, we're surveying law enforcement. And again, what we hear is the human behaviors persist and technology is making it go faster, it's making it easier, it's confusing the issue because we don't always know, are we looking at an image that took place offline, or is that an image that was the result of an AI generative model? But now technology is starting to help with that process. It is being deployed on the front lines, and we use our research to help build the technology in service of combating these issues at scale. So one of our primary products, we provide to industry, to platforms, so that they can detect child sexual exploitation and be reporting it at scale. So now not only are they able to recognize images that we have previously seen, and I don't want to get too into the technical weeds, I think maybe Dave might do that for us.
Love weeds.
Love weeds, perfect. But then on top of it, with classifiers, with machine learning, we're now able to recognize images that we've never seen before. And that offers 2 things, 2 really critical things. When you think about that volume of content, I want to put a little bit of scale on the numbers of people whose job it is every day to find those kids and those images. When I was doing this work, there were 10 of us at that team that was responsible for reviewing that content. Now, trust and safety teams are increasingly part of the equation, but you look globally at the law enforcement teams specialized in these cases, we have fewer than 1,000 investigators around the globe who specialize in finding the kids in these images. So when you have 63 million images and fewer than 1,000 people, if we are not fully leveraging the abilities of technology to shrink the haystack for them, to find the kids in immediate danger so they can focus there, then we're falling behind.
Thanks for situating us there, Melissa. So I want to turn to Becky, and I want to, I think, help sort of broaden from the maybe one of the most dire and difficult of topics that comes up in this space to sort of shift the focus a little bit. I think probably, hopefully, most of us are not dealing with the kinds of issues that Melissa just described in our daily lives. I know I personally, when it comes to travel, which is one of my passions, spend a lot of time using Tripadvisor and thinking about some of the issues that may not be thought of as in the same zone when it comes to trust and safety and content moderation, but which nonetheless provide both AI challenges and AI opportunities. And that's the kind of work that Becky leads at Tripadvisor, looking at what kind of policies and what kind of content should be allowed, how to prevent fraud and fake reviews, and also keeping people safe who are actually out there in the world traveling. So Becky, what does AI look like for you, and how's it changing the work that you do?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me here today. The commute was interesting, especially I'm originally from Florida, so I don't drive in the snow very often, but I made it. So yeah, I'm Becky Foley. I lead trust and safety for the Tripadvisor group, and that means I'm responsible for the policies and enforcement around traveler safety on and off platform. And David, you mentioned that trust and safety professionals for a long time have met AI with a level of caution. And that's absolutely true. In my career, there have been many third parties, vendors that have come to me and said, I have AI that will solve all of your problems. We are going to be able to detect inappropriate content and allow you to scale in ways that you've never imagined. And so, okay, great, let's test it out. And dozens of tests over the years, not one single time led to an increase in our ability to detect inappropriate content at scale in a way that we wanted to for a platform like Tripadvisor, because you have to understand that every single user-generated content platform has a different set of policies and things that they enforce. So Tripadvisor has what I would consider a more stringent policy on the type of text that we allow because of the way our product is built. Our product is publicly available to all users. You don't need to follow a specific user. You don't need to be friends with them. There's not text or images that are operating in the shadows. Everything that happens on Tripadvisor and Viator platforms is publicly available. So our content policies are a little bit more stringent, and we also don't get the same types of content that maybe big tech platforms get, like a Meta, et cetera. So back to, we did several different tests with many AI vendors. None of them were successful. And then here we are a couple of years ago, generative AI comes on the scene. And again, we're always happy to test new technology and see the results that we might get. And so very first thing we started to test out was our policies around hate speech. You can imagine in the travel business, we're in the business of bringing people together. And when we bring people together across different cultures, different political views, different backgrounds, a side effect of that is discriminatory speech, hate speech, and being able to balance that with what we would typically violate our guidelines, our policies, with what we want to be able to include because it might depict a cultural difference, can be very complex. So we tested our first model based on hate speech and discrimination, and we found it to be 99.2% accurate against our policies. So that is more accurate than the humans that we had historically reviewing that content. But even more important, more accurate in identifying it right at the point of submission versus it getting posted, impacting a business owner, impacting other users of our site, being able to capture and differentiate between the policy abiding types of text and images and those violations. So we were able to deploy generative AI towards our text moderation. We're now automating 99.7% of all text moderation across the site, with a 68% increase in identifying that text right at submission when it was inappropriate. One of the most important things and the biggest value add that actually happened very recently is that Tripadvisor, as I said, we're not a platform that people necessarily use to operate in the shadows. So in proportion to the amount of content, billions of reviews and opinions that we get, the number of terrorist threats, the number of CSAM submissions that we get is minuscule. So it's not that it never happens, it's just that it's a very small portion of what does happen. But that means historically we spent a lot of resource aimed at problems that weren't at scale for us and weren't necessarily solving issues for our travelers, but of course it's something that we ethically and morally needed to identify. But to be honest, we weren't always necessarily the best at it and definitely not the fastest. But now we can train AI models to identify this type of content more quickly, more accurately, and with a wildly less amount of technological resource to be able to do it. So we're able to report these types of issues very quickly to NECMEC or to local law enforcement, when previously it would take us more time to be able to find that content and report it out. So that's on the winning side, and I can talk at some point on the challenges that it still presents, if that makes sense.
We will definitely have time to talk about the challenges, but this is a rare panel of guarded optimism in the world of online safety, which is often one of as trade-offs and sadness, as Dave's wife has put it. So, Dave, turning to you, so you can perhaps tell folks a little bit about your background and how you came into this and what the work that you've done over the years, starting at Facebook, Airbnb, OpenAI, and now at Zentropi. And I think maybe you can help to unpack for this audience, which may be kind of less in the weeds on these issues, kind of what the old sort of model for content policy creation and enforcement looked like. What were the problems with it? And what are the changes that we're seeing that you've been working on, and what that could look like concretely?
Yeah, absolutely. So for context, you did a good job with the panel. We all kind of interlink. So I started my career at Facebook quite early on as a content moderator, and ended up writing the company's initial content policies because those didn't exist and there was no one to do it. And I foolishly volunteered. And was there for 6 years and worked on both the sort of content policy and the tooling for implementing the policy, because when companies are small, these kinds of things are less differentiated. Then spent 6 years at Airbnb working on problems very similar to the Tripadvisor set of issues, but with like an additional side of Craigslist problems because people were meeting in real life. And similarly there, thought a lot about sort of policy and its intersection with tooling and how we make the policies real. Because if the rules that you have, no matter what they say, can't be performed by the company, they're not really rules. They're like a cool set of hopes you wrote on your website, which don't help anyone. Ended up, after Airbnb at OpenAI, doing a sort of similar set of things of helping them figure out what the rules of the road should be for the launch of DALL-E, ChatGPT, and GPT-4, and got fascinated by sort of the subject of this panel, which is the observation, which in retrospect fits with a lot of the rest of what I've done in my career, that we've always in trust and safety been trying to push forward the frontier of what we could automate, because the fundamental governing dynamic of online trust and safety is one of being completely overwhelmed by the scale of the problem you're facing compared to the number of people you have to attack the problem. And so in my time at Facebook, we worked on the first implementation of something called photo DNA, which is the sort of industry-shared hashing database for identifying known CSAM images, which seemed like a really great solution at the time, and then everybody got way better at producing images. And so the sort of known image cataloging thing, while still helpful, fell behind and we needed new technology. And similarly at Airbnb, we did a lot of work on various kinds of prediction around when reservations might go wrong and lead to violent incidents. But that was limited and difficult to do and inaccurate and messy. And then all across that board, we spent a lot of time on various sorts of historical black box machine learning classifiers, right? Classifiers, more primitive versions of AI than what we're talking about here today, have been used in the field for a very long time to try to identify content, but they were cumbersome to train, very inaccurate, had all kinds of problems. Still often better than nothing as a pre-filter, but not great. And in my time at OpenAI, I sort of had this like scales from my eyes moment of like, oh, this machinery that we're working on is going to cause an enormous number of problems because it can do all of these very powerful things in terms of content generation. But also it can do something functionally closer to reading and giving a verdict based on that reading. It's closer to what we've previously only been able to have humans help us do. And if we can take seriously the possibility there of, hey, can we train an AI model using generative AI, using language models, to not just predict the outcome of a given piece of content based on a bunch of statistical patterns, but actually read a content policy, a set of criteria, no matter how idiosyncratic, and apply that specific set of criteria in that moment to a piece of content to identify it, we'd then have a system where we could change the criteria and immediately change our entire scale classification system. And so I ended up leaving OpenAI, going to Stanford for a year where I met my co-founder who had a similar, like, oh my God, realization. And the two of us liked working together so well and made so much progress that we were able to fine-tune a very, very, very small language model. Think something like 1% the size of GPT-4 or 5. So it's fast, it's cheap. It was something we could open source that is tuned specifically to follow content policy instructions and apply them. And that small scale means that at the scale the trust and safety operates at, you can actually afford, as both a financial matter and a latency matter from a user interface point of view, to deploy this thing and use it to go find stuff. Okay, cool. Now getting to David's actual question. Solving that bottleneck of applying policies is one thing, but all systems have bottlenecks. Bottlenecks can never not exist, they just move. And in breaking the bottleneck of policy application, it very rapidly became obvious in working with customers and even our own work that we were also bad at writing policy well. In addition to being bad at applying it, we were also bad at producing it. It's just that hadn't been a problem because we were so bad at using it that it didn't matter we were bad at writing it. And so we then turned our focus towards trying to develop agentic systems that could take a policy text, take a set of examples that you had graded you believed accurately according to that policy text, look at where those lined up and where they did not line up, and use even bigger language models, what the sort of $5 term would be agents, so like specially configured AI with particular perspectives, to try to rewrite the policy text to more clearly capture what it is you seemed to want to classify. And we could check whether the rewrite worked because we could ask our very small, fast grading machine whether it got closer to the labels you said were correct. And I can get even more into the weeds about how all of this works, but at a high level, it's not just the case that AI as a practical matter is something we can use to do better detection, although that is very much true. Being able to do better and more flexible detection changes the design constraints of all of the systems that depend on that detection, and changes the demands of all of the practices we have to support that detection. So it has changed what we need in terms of having to move towards automating, clarifying and refining policy, but also being able to move towards clarifying and refining policy. And we're not done, right? Like in attacking that bottleneck, there are then become other bottlenecks around finding example edge cases because some of these things are very rare, and so you might not even have the examples you need to dial in the policy, so can we go back and help you figure those things out? There's there's all of these very practical, tactical applications of this stuff that are not theoretical, not long-term forecasts, but are happening now. It's mostly a matter of figuring out how to build a train around the steam engine. The steam engine already exists.
So I want to just check and see whether Melissa or Becky, you have anything you'd want to weigh in with in response to Dave or to one another before I have some questions as well, but just...
Good.
No? Okay. So I think, maybe to go back to the some of the issues that Harry raised in his keynote and sort of questions about what's the impact of AI on sort of employment and labor. When we think about this world, we think, you all have, in different respects, experiences kind of having done frontline sort of either content moderation or receiving and analyzing those reports. Nick, Melissa, we know that automation is going to, and the move to AI is transforming the kind of the way that humans work with in these jobs, some of which has been widely reported as not being great. But at the same time, there's, I think, potential for a fair amount of dislocation. And I'm just would be curious to hear from each of you about how you feel, where you see, without making over-ambitious predictions, but let's talk sort of trends in terms of the role of humans and the role of technology when it comes to dealing with the kind of content and behavior we're trying to do something about in your jobs.
I'm happy to kick it off. So I don't think that it is possible to ignore the fact that, especially when you just heard me talking about 99.7% of text moderation is now automated and in a more accurate way than the humans that were previously doing it. The thing that is changing is the type of work that those humans are doing. So in trust and safety and in most customer service or support functions, there's a race. How many can you do in an hour? How many can you do correctly in an hour? A constant push to be able to do it faster. And a lot of times the humans that are doing this review don't have the time or the autonomy to necessarily sit back and figure out how to do it 100% correct. So what we've seen actually is just that there is a shift in the speed required to do the work, because what's being done right now is the most complex work from those that are doing content moderation or trust and safety or safety, off-platform safety work with Tripadvisor. And so they have more flexibility, more time to be able to do those more complex cases, support cases, et cetera, correctly. So yes, the role has changed, it's shifted, and it's actually shifted for the better at Tripadvisor in better pursuit of serving our customers and our travelers in the best way. So.
For us, one of the biggest things is we always need a human in the exchange for the issue that we look at, and I think for some of the others, and that's not to say all of it, and that has been slow progress. When PhotoDNA came along, I still remember there was so much resistance among those of us even that were reviewing the content to trust the pDNA signatures even, and we're not even getting into classifiers at that point because of the concern that you might miss just one, and that weighs with, CSAM or any other crime type. The thing that could slip through is scary to the people who raise their hand to do this every single day. And at the same time, there's so much need. We are so under-resourced in this area. We are just starting to get a little bit more current in terms of, instead of reviewing the image that we have already looked at that exact same image 1,000 times this week alone, well, now instead we're seeing new content and we're seeing predictions of this is a text exchange which is showing all the signs of sadistic extortion and a group, a network around that. And so what it ultimately is enabling us to do is to get better in building a safer community in general and focus our efforts there, responding ahead of when the actual abuse has happened, in the sense of we were always hanging on, CSAM had to have been created. And anything before that, there was no world where you were getting to anything before CSAM was being produced, being shared, really importantly, because oftentimes that's what, and that it would have to be recognized. If you're on a platform that has over 1 billion files being shared every single day, to find that needle in the haystack, we've got a really long road to walk before some of that really starts to, that the teams we work with generally still don't have a queue that's insanely long for them to be getting to. So that's kind of a non-answer for you, but I'm just excited to spend more of our time looking for the kids who are still in active abuse instead of trying to find the pictures of that abuse happening.
Yeah, I will cop to being a naked and perhaps somewhat unpopularly so optimist here, at least in our domain in particular. And I say this having done this job, having done a bunch of the review, not I think as much as you ended up doing, but done a bunch of the review as part of the photo-DNA work. Jobs are not good for people simply because they exist, right? And we need to differentiate between the broader concern about a good economic transition in what I think is basically an industrial transition moment, which historically, in my understanding, we have not managed super well. And from like feeling sad about certain kinds of job roles going away simply because they exist as job roles that you can be employed for today, because some things you can get paid money for are horrifying. And it is actively good if we can find a way to substitute for needing humans to do those things. And to me, the sort of front line, all I do all day is sit in a queue and grind away looking for these awful things, or even worse, looking through an already filtered queue of awful things to find the most particularly awful ones, is not conducive to human thriving. And it's good if we are able to find ways to substitute in for that. I'd also say, I think particularly in like a legal context, there's often a gap I have found between people's understanding of what the scale of the process means, and you both touched on this, and sort of how the judgment making can work. Because when you say things like, oh, well, folks don't have a lot of time, the response you often get is like, give them more time. But you can give them 10 times more time, and that's still only 30 seconds, and 30 seconds is still not enough time to make the judgment any better. But it does make you have to hire 10 times more people, which then means you have to train 10 times more people, which then actually makes things worse. And so the scale of the problem binds what you can achieve with people in ways that, in my experience, tend to make humans less capable than you might think they are at doing certain kinds of the judgments in practice at the scale that those judgments have to be performed. The photo-DNA example here was really instructive. We were trying to establish standards to classify those banks, to sort of classify material into, we have to send this to NCMEC, versus legally, we don't have to send this to NCMEC, and we don't want to because we don't want to flood their queues, but it's still really gross and we want to delete it. And hey, actually, we don't care about this, we don't want to review it again. And the folks that we had been having doing NCMEC reports, who were all employees who went to like Stanford and Harvard, other enthusiastic young people, we had them do some grading exercises without talking to each other. And they agreed about 40% of the time about what we should be sending to NCMEC. Because we had assumed that they had reached consensus absent guidance, and they hadn't. And the way that we ended up solving that was we in practice built an algorithm, albeit not out of technology, right? We went and built a flow chart of a bunch of specific judgments for how to end up in category A and how to end up in category B. And at that point, you are in fact already automating. You're just forcing people to do the automation, which I don't see as better if the results are not somehow clearly better.
Yeah. And, you know, another example that I've heard of, and I find the example so illustrative, it's just, we don't necessarily think of, well, that's the place where AI could make such a huge difference. when, and I, you know, trust and safety has got similar examples of this with the policies and the algorithms to help align. One of the ones that comes to mind for investigators when they're putting in for a search warrant or for an arrest warrant off of CSAM images, I mean, this is literally a crime scene photo of a child's assault. And that investigator has to sit down and write out the description of everything that they see in that image so that that can be presented, because oftentimes the image is not what is presented to a court or to a judge or to a sentencing commission. They have to sit there and write down what they see in that image. AI can do that. There's no reason that that investigator who could be now going on to the next case, or that investigator that's already seen that image hundreds of times as they scrutinized every possible birthmark or tire or license plate to help find that child, there's no reason in the world why that dad, before he gets to go home and have dinner with his kids, has to write that out. That's something AI is doing for us now and is being increasingly trained to do well. You still need to have somebody review it. It has to be reviewed for accuracy until we get to the place that it is trusted and it is performant or enough. But there will be a point where that investigator doesn't have to do that anymore. And that's a huge win.
Building on that, actually, another sort of like conflation I think we do is assuming that because the automation we've historically encountered in these sort of domains or in domains of language, you know, everybody calls the pharmacy and then yells at the bot to let them talk to a person because the bot is incompetent.
I say it very calmly.
I just start saying human until it gives up. But like, I don't actually think we dislike talking to the pharmacy bot. I think we dislike that the pharmacy bot is bad at its job. Yeah. And that is important to distinguish in thinking about this. Yeah. And this moment to me is very exciting. I majored in anthropology. Like, I am not an engineer. I cannot code. My co-founder went to MIT, so our technology is safe to use. But like, the amount that you can do as a practitioner and an expert in one of these more humanistic areas now, from an automation point of view, is vastly better than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And to me, that is probably the secret to getting to automation that is in fact trustworthy. Because instead of the automation coming out of folks who don't have the subject matter expertise, but have the expertise to be able to make automation, it can actually come from the people who have the ground level expertise in doing the thing and who are able to build the trustworthy building blocks as they go along, such that the end system is one that you can actually rely on. But that is itself work. It's a frankly more interesting, I think, certainly fun kind of work. But it is going to take, it's not going to just happen. You don't just plug it in and it gets solved. You have to do the work of figuring out, how do I get this to be reliable enough that I can actually trust it? Yeah.
All right, well, let's not be too optimistic here. And I am curious, just given the amount of news stories recently come with various challenges that are being exacerbated or enabled by AI, whether it comes to, AI-generated, CSAM, fake reviews, non-consensual intimate imagery, the list goes on and on. So there is a bit of an arms race here in terms of, can our AI deal with the stuff that others are using AI to throw at us? And would just be curious to hear from each of you a little bit of sort of where you see that happening right now, and what are maybe some promising developments in terms of trying to deal with some of those kind of AI-generated risks and harms.
I can start. Well, one of the things that I would say, so one of the risks that you'll hear a lot in my industry is that AI has catapulted fake reviews into an undetectable % of content. And in reality, that is not actually true, in that AI-generated text in reviews is only present in less than 5% of fake content that we've detected at Tripadvisor. And we have very accurate detection methods for AI-generated text that we've tested across multiple different platforms and use cases. And what it is that we're using that signal, we call it a signal, every single piece of content submitted to Tripadvisor is associated with hundreds of pieces of metadata that we use to collect patterns of abnormality for fake content. And we use AI-generated text as a signal, but it's definitely not the piece that's the silver bullet that says, yes, this is definitely a fake piece of content. There's a ton of people using AI to generate content in really good ways. People that find it much easier to use AI to write about their experiences, but they had a genuine experience. So I think that, yes, AI for user-generated content is definitely a challenge. Authentic user-generated content has never been more desired than it is right now and today. And particularly when you're looking for advice on something, on where to go or how to spend your hard-earned money on a trip, you're looking for authentic experiences. And that's definitely something that as AI becomes more prolific in search results and in helping you make those decisions, purchasing decisions, it still needs to be rooted in authentic advice or guidance from others who have been there before you or bought that product before you. So that won't change, and the use of AI won't change necessarily the ability for us to get that authentic content. So it definitely has been another tool that bad actors are using to try and circumvent our systems, but it's just, this isn't the first new tool or new technology that's come that has helped bad actors be more prolific.
I don't want to be predictable on being doom and gloom, so I'm going to take a different approach. I think everybody in the room has heard about, the scary nature and scale of deep fakes. For me, a little bit of if I can find a silver lining in everything that AI is bringing in terms of risks for young people as it relates to sexual exploitation, is it is really challenging us to fall back on more durable protective factors like open conversations with their families, with their communities, learning about the impacts. We've done surveys with young people about deepfakes as an example, and this was data collected 2 or 3 years ago now, so it was really before it was even gaining the momentum. And at that point, of the teens that we surveyed, 1 in 17 had already experienced somebody creating a deepfake of them. So now that can maybe feel like a small number, but think about how many kids are in the average high school classroom. Think about how many kids are on the soccer team, right? It is impacting kids. It's impacting their communities. They're coming up against it. And oftentimes, it is other kids who are creating the deepfakes of them. And we have seen the response from this. We have seen it swaying everywhere from, we need to lock up that 14-year-old and throw away the key. They're a sex offender because they created a deep fake, to the other end of the spectrum of, boys will be boys. And the reality is, when we talk to those kids, more kids than the adults that we've spoken to are very clear that creating a deep fake of somebody is wrong. It doesn't matter that it is fake, it is synthetic. It does not matter. More kids than adults see clearly that it is not acceptable to create a non-consensual nude of someone else. That's something to give us hope. They have greater clarity than some of the adults out there do. And it's also putting the response to adults that we cannot default to the conversation of, just don't talk to strangers. Just don't share nudes. If you just don't share nudes, you're never going to be sextorted. The reality is, in the kids that we've spoken with who have experienced sextortion, 1 in 8 of them were threatened with a deepfake. So not taking an image is not enough anymore. And as parents, we need to realize that if a child comes to us and says, this is happening to me. I swear I didn't take that picture. And with our own eyes, we can't tell the difference. We have to trust our kids as much as we're asking them to trust us, that we will be a safe space for them if something goes wrong online. And so I'm seeing a lot more conversation around that right now than the default, well, just don't share nudes, just don't talk to strangers, because there's a need for a much more durable relationship there to help our young people navigate online experiences, not just as teenagers, because that world doesn't change when they turn 18, and we need to make sure that they're prepared for that as well.
I get to be the maybe somewhat less optimistic. It's complicated this time. I think that the sort of, we are in an arms race because the production of all of this stuff is dramatically easier. On the sort of optimistic note, before getting to the pessimism, defense is always disproportionately more expensive than offense and requires more labor. And so all else equal, it does seem to me that labor-saving devices are probably more helpful to us. However, figuring out how to defend well is more complicated to do than figuring out how to wreck things. And so part of the reason, like, we ended up starting this company is we think it's actually deeply urgent that, given that this technology just does exist and is not going to stop existing, we figure out how to use it as soon as possible, because it's going to take us longer to figure out how to use it well. That said, there are certain things where it's very hard for me to see how you use the technology in a helpful way defensively, or it's much more difficult. And here I want to differentiate between content that is fake and content that is bad, to be sort of reductionist. Insofar as content contains a thing that you can recognize by looking at the image or reading the text, we are going to be able to tackle that from an automation point of view, because it doesn't really matter whether you had an AI write the racist threat. It's a racist threat, right? And so you can just recognize that it is that thing, which is per se something you don't want, and act on it. That gets really complicated in places where the content is not necessarily bad, right? And this is where NCII gets really complicated, because surface level, the consent is not in the image. It is simply a nude image. And so we've always, I think, struggled with dealing with that even in a pre-AI world. And it feels more difficult to tackle those kinds of problems from a sort of defensive automation point of view, because the thing that you want to hinge the judgment on isn't knowable to any AI in looking at the image. And that feels like it's going to be a really difficult road for us. Other places like this are misinformation, disinformation, anything where sort of truth or accuracy is the sort of background question. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's a lot more complicated. You start to have to think about like database sources to try to feed into the AI to cross-verify, and like that is going to be tough, and we're going to struggle to figure that out.
So maybe we're going to go to questions momentarily, but just to tie those three observations together, it's that whether it's the people who are using your service, the people out there in the world who could potentially fall victim to some of these tools and tactics, or if you're a person trying to figure out how to play defense against this, there is an essential human element that will never go away, no matter how challenging or how good the technological opportunities to work there is. And so I think with that, we can probably open it up to questions from the audience. As many folks here know, at Silicon Flatirons, we have the Phil Weiser rule that a student should ask the first question. I will hope that some students have some questions prepared, and we'll take guidance from faculty to identify students if we don't have one, but I see one right here in the front. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, here we go.
Okay, real quick, I'm not a CU student, but I'm a college student. Does that still fine?
Yes, yes.
So we're in a law firm right now, or law school, and so my question's gonna be more focused about law. Our legal system evolved around the assumption that decision makers have moral agency and responsibility. But as algorithmic systems increasingly influence our decisions in finance, law, hiring, and governance, We effectively delegate authority to those systems without any moral understanding, only statistical optimization. Do you think our legal framework is fundamentally underprepared for this shift? And how should we think about accountability when the decision maker is an algorithm?
It's a great question. I will open it up to our panel with, I think, the caveat that I think this is a not unheard of, but relatively uncommon Silicon Flatirons panel where I don't think we have any lawyers up here. So no legal advice to be offered, but if anybody wants to jump in on that one.
I do think it's important to sit behind the fact that at this point, for the most part, most of the algorithms that platforms are implementing are built by humans. And there are a lot of checks and balances in place, especially for publicly leveraged algorithms. And so that level of, there's a few different things, is making sure that there's the transparency in place, and actually by law, specifically in the EU and in the UK, transparency is required. So when you have those algorithms, you have to actually explain what went into them, how they were built, how you're testing them, how people are allowed to appeal the algorithmic decisions. And I know Tripadvisor Group actually applies those laws globally, so there's transparency here in the US that is above and beyond the US required transparency. And so that's really how we're thinking about it. Yes, everything is built algorithmically and by humans, with human checks, and with user accountability in place.
Anybody else want to jump in on that, or?
I think that caps it off.
Yeah, I'm not as worried about it in the specific domain we work in, because a lot of the work in the domain we work in has been automated for a very long time. And so it's a field with sort of a lot of muscles and instincts around how to think about responsibility for your automated systems. I am actually pretty worried about it in the context of things like people's personal assistant agents. I am not a lawyer, but I don't understand how your OpenClaw went out and signed a contract is supposed to work or make any sense. So yeah, I think your anxiety about the systems themselves not being set up for a world in which things that are not people can do something that seems like agency is valid, but what we do about that, I have no idea.
So maybe we can take a couple of questions. I see two in the back there, and we'll take those two and then see if we can work in a couple more.
Hello, my name is Becky Mandel. I'm an attorney that does a lot of regulatory work in different areas, including data privacy. So going to the question of sort of offense, defense, is it possible to train AI to make decisions based on kindness and compassion?
And let's take the gentleman who was standing in the rear as well, and then we can divvy those up.
Okay, hey, my name is Ken Frickless. I'm here in the context of I'm the head of multimodal safety for ML Commons. I've actually worked a little bit with Melissa in the past. Basically my question is more about who has responsibility. So on sort of an ethical basis, you've got tool vendors who are creating the generative tools which allow you to create deepfakes, for example. There's also the users. And so there is a trade-off between these three parties who are part of this system, one of which is the guys who are actually letting you build the deepfake, one of which is the one platform on which you're posting it. And the third one is the end user who's actually doing the thing that might be illegal. Gets fairly complex. So I just was wondering if some of you folks can address that. Seems to all three of you probably have an opinion on that.
Great. All right.
So should just take any of them? Or?
Yeah, take.
Well, so one of the things I would say on that last question is, if a model is being created explicitly for the purpose of creating CSAM, that's, to the earlier point of, is this illegal? Yes, no. At that point, there's clear intent behind the model production. Now, if you've similarly got, say, a nudifying app, that is advertising being able to nudify or to support images if their gallery is clearly posting CSAM of what users have been able to produce using that service. And similarly, if you have a user who, number one, say the output is very clearly CSAM. You don't have much debate over it if you've got a prepubescent image there as opposed to maybe pubescent, but you also have the prompts involved, and if there are clear directions guiding the model to produce, because we know that there's a lot of opportunity within safety by design to reduce the likelihood of a model being able to output CSAM, but there's also a lot of creativity by users out there who are really working hard to get around some of those, and when there are very clear breadcrumbs about the intent of that, I think that becomes a little bit more black and white with my very narrow scope. I think maybe that becomes a little more challenging for other media types.
Yeah, so on your question, I on some level think I am on some level less interested in the ethical question than I am in the question of what the useful intervention points are. So I agree with all of that. To me, that points us towards a sort of due diligence kind of idea for both the model makers and the platform distributors. It doesn't strike me as like a totally new thing to think about products that have certain kinds of risks and that cannot be reduced to zero, but we have expectations for manufacturers to get it to some acceptable level we've all agreed on. Is like, that feels approximately right. And also, I think we need to think carefully about where we put responsibility from a sort of realistic reduction in the volume of harm point of view. And to me, that's maybe more important than the like, who is morally responsible question. Because I am pretty pessimistic given the difficulties that systems like NCMEC already have with keeping up with the volumes of reports we have, that we can like individual responsibility our way out of this just as a purely practical matter, no matter where you net out on the ethical question. So agree, but also tend to sort of think we need to push more upstream simply pragmatically, since we all agree this is like bad and shouldn't happen. On the kindness question, you have to define for me what that means, because it's a pattern repeating machine. And so like, yes, you can train AI for some understanding of what kindness and compassion is, but you do that by building a big pile of things you think are kind and compassionate that are like reasonably internally consistent, and then it learns to kind of ape the vibe of the pile of kind things you built. So the question is actually, what is kind and compassionate, and how do you know that? And how do we agree that your knowing is right? And how do we then build a big pile of data that is that?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of build on that one there is from my use case, a big question right now is what are the risk considerations with a model that is built to behave in a way that is overly human in terms of behaving in a kind way or behaving in any of those ways, and the impact that that could have on the users and kids in particular, asking the question of should models behave in a way that is very clearly reiterating, I am a machine, not a human. I am here to answer questions. I can't be your friend. I can guide you to a support system. I can't be your support system. And so I think that through my lens, I agree with all of that. Do we have a shared definition of what kind looks like? And from a kid's use case, should a model be trained to behave as a human would at that point?
I would offer that we have clear evidence that it should not.
So we're just about at time. I want to give Becky a chance to answer any of that she wants.
The only thing I would add is that who's responsible? At this point, everything is moving so quickly that every single one of those points is responsible. The app that was used to create the image text, the platform that is posting it, and the individual user themselves, all three should be culpable for figuring out a solution to make sure that the bad content is not impacting others.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're, please, thanks to the panel. And